welcome everybody. For those of you guys joining us in China, good morning. Thank you for joining us bright and early. Those of you guys joining us from the US, thank you for taking time in the evening. And for everybody else, good day. My name is Devin Lau. I'm the Assistant Director of Yale Center Beijing. And for those of you guys that are new to us, we were established in October 2014. So it's now been, 6 years. We often host talks and events showing the best that Yale has to offer, spanning all different schools and departments at Yale. And we are lucky today to have a topic that's of interest to many of you, which is psychology, and also talking about the psychology of well-being, which is a hot topic. I know mental health is continuing to be of increased interest in China. And so we're happy to have a special professor from Yale today joining us. Quick introduction for our speaker. Robb Rutledge is an assistant professor of psychology at Yale. He got his bachelor's from Caltech and his PhD from New York University. Previous to Yale, he was also on faculty at University College London. His research has been covered by many popular international news outlets, including the New York Times, BBC, The Atlantic, Time, and The Guardian, amongst many others. And his research is quite interesting, especially in the age of technology and big data. His research combines computational models with neuroimaging, pharmacology, and smartphone-based data collection to study the relationship between decision-making and emotions across one's lifespan. And he'll be sharing today about a special app that he's developed with his lab and how they're using that app to understand the psychology of well-being, not just in the US, which is where a lot of, or maybe Western Europe, where a lot of studies have historically been done, but he's trying to get a more comprehensive global understanding of the psychology of well-being. So this is a topic of interest that I've had with many professors and have had many discussions, and it's great to have Professor Rutledge here to actually discuss that with us. And so without further ado, here's Professor Rutledge.
Okay, cool.
Sorry, I will say, sorry, one more thing.
Yes.
Because we're on Zoom, it would be great if people who are willing and able to turn on their cameras so that Professor Rutledge is not just talking to a blank screen. So it's always good to have some sort of interaction. Us here in the US, we've been quarantined for more than a year now. And so it's good to at least see some faces. So for those of you guys that are willing to help out in that way, it would be great if you could turn on your cameras if you're able to. Thanks.
Well, especially during the discussion that follows the presentation.
Right.
Yeah, it'd be great to see some of your faces when we're chatting about some of these issues. And I'll be interested to hear what people want to talk about and what kind of ideas people have. So I'm going to start with a question. How happy are you right now? Okay. So if I ask you on a scale from 0 to 10, how happy are you? And that may seem, kind of a weird question to be asked. If you just woke up, maybe that's kind of weird. If you're about to go to sleep, the times make things a little strange. But you could probably come up with a number, and you might have some idea of where it came from. So if you slept well last night, say you're in Beijing right now, you slept well last night, and your breakfast was good. You just kind of started your day, and you're feeling pretty good. So you kind of have some idea of like what your number comes from. Even though there might be some things you're not so sure about. And what I want to know is, if I ask you again in half an hour, can I predict whether your number will change? Can I predict whether your number will go up a little bit or go down a little bit? I want to know, if I know what you've experienced, can I say something about how you might be feeling from moment to moment? Now, questions about happiness are not really new, okay? So these are actually questions people have been asking in some form for several thousand years. So this is a quote from Aristotle: "Happiness is the meaning and purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence." Now, that doesn't really tell us how to actually understand it, but it does kind of say that this is something we should be thinking about. As humans, we should be thinking about what happiness is and how to obtain it and what would make it go up and down. And that's partly what my lab is trying to do. We're trying to understand what makes happiness go up and down. You might think, that if you had more money, you'd be happier. A lot of people think that. It's a very natural thing to be thinking. So it's a very natural starting point for thinking about how do we do a more quantitative, rigorous science for happiness. Now, unfortunately, the data isn't that helpful, or let's say it's not that reassuring, because what's been repeatedly shown is that when people win the lottery, they are happier, and that lasts for a while. But a year later, their happiness tends to be pretty close to where they started out, and so it isn't the life-changing, um, lifelong increase in happiness that many people believe it should be. But there is this transient change in happiness. So it's clear that having this extra surprising increase in income does change happiness. It just doesn't change it in the way that people think it will. So economists are also interested in this puzzle of how happiness and money are related. This is a very well-known plot for the US and the UK, where the GDP over a 30-year period almost doubled, but there was no change in happiness at all. So this one measure of happiness, no change at all. And obviously, you could think about reasons why this might be the case. GDP may not be the best measure. Gross domestic product is not really capturing all individuals. It's kind of capturing something closer to an average. And the wealth might not be distributed evenly. We know that those are true, but if we think back 30 or 40 years, we didn't have computers then, we didn't have smartphones, healthcare, like there have been major medical advances in that period. So there's a lot that has changed in that period. We can tell by some objective measures that quality of life is better than it was 40 years ago, but happiness doesn't seem to be something that also increased at the same time. So that's a bit of a puzzle. But I still think that reward or wealth is something that we should explore in relation to happiness, because it is something we know a lot about. And in particular, because of my background, which is in neuroscience, we know a lot about the neurobiology of reward. So the dopamine neurons that are in each of your midbrains, the base of the brain, are sending signals throughout the brain to, in particular, the frontal cortex at the front of the brain and the striatum kind of in the middle of the brain. And those signals are very likely to be linked to the rewards that we're receiving. There's a lot of data that is consistent with this. And we're now at the point where we're trying to understand what the relevance of this is to happiness. But I think this provides an excellent starting point for a better understanding of what determines happiness, because there's so much known about the neurobiology of reward. So what does dopamine do? Well, if you're in a situation where you go to a casino and you place a bet on red, you know that you'll win this spin about half the time. You'll double your money half the time. And let's say on this particular play, the ball rolls to a stop on red and you double your money. And it's thought that at this moment, the dopamine neurons in your brain represent what's called a reward prediction error, the difference between what you got and what you expected to get. So in this particular situation, that's a positive prediction error. You got more than you should expect to get on average. And that's associated with a burst of dopamine in your brain. And if you lost the gamble, there would be a dip in dopamine that would signal that disappointment. And in humans, we can do something using an MRI machine. We can measure blood oxygen levels throughout the brain. And in particular, we can look at the brain areas. These are the areas in the center of the brain. This is the striatum. This is a view from the front. So I'm looking at your brain, and I can see in this image how the blood oxygen is increasing in this brain area when someone gets a positive prediction error compared to a negative prediction error. So that's our starting point. We know a lot about the neurobiology of reward. We know there's this idea of reward prediction errors that are actually really important for thinking about algorithms for artificial intelligence, something we don't have time to go into here, but there's a lot of evidence that these are really important signals for driving human behavior. And so we built a smartphone app a few years ago. We also ran the equivalent lab experiments, but I'll just show you the smartphone version of it. It was called the Great Brain Experiment. We have a new smartphone app called the Happiness Project, which has a similar version of this game, pretty similar version of this game, which is now available and which we're now using for our happiness research. But this is what the simple experiment looks like. So you're making choices between safe and risky options and just trying to win as many points as you can. So you rate how you feel every once in a while during the game. So this gamble, you have 50-50 gamble where you could win or lose points. Okay, so here they chose to gamble. They could try to win 75 points, but unfortunately they lost. Here's a gamble where here's a trial where you can't win anything. You can only choose between losing some amount of points for sure, or trying to avoid losing. Another loss, so not doing that well. Maybe the luck will turn around here. All right, 124 points. So they got back all the points they lost. And another one. All right, 85 more points. Okay, so this person should be pretty happy now. They just won the last 2 gambles after a little string of bad luck. And so you can see that there's a lot of stuff going on, and in a pretty short period of time, so a minute, you can see that your happiness when you're doing this task might go up and down. And so that's what we're trying to really capture using mathematical equations. So this is the lab data. So people started out in the lab with 20 pounds. This is work that I started at University College London. And in each of these 3 example participants, you can see that they're earning money over the course of an hour-long experiment, ending up with over 30 pounds for each of these people. So they should be pretty happy about that. That's what you'd expect. We're asking them once a minute how they're feeling as they're playing through more than 100 trials of this experiment. But this is what the data looks like. So in blue is their happiness rating. So there's a lot of things we can see here. So the first thing is that their happiness and their wealth are not the same thing. So at least in an hour-long experiment, those things are not the same. Okay, that's the first thing that's pretty obvious. The second thing is that actually there's a lot of variation in how they feel. It's not just like they're reporting the same number all the time. They are actually moving their ratings around all over the place. So I think that's really reassuring, because even though their wealth is not a good predictor of how happy they will report being, there is clearly a lot of signal that we might potentially be able to explain by looking at what happened to people during the task. And these are the averages across 26 participants in the lab. And we can see that their wealth is going up, but their happiness is not. Now, this may remind you of that plot I showed you just a minute ago. GDP is increasing over 30 years and happiness is not. Same thing happens over an hour-long period. So in both these situations, when we look at the averages, we see there isn't a close relationship between these 2 things. But of course, remember that when we look at individual participants, there's a lot of movement in their happiness. It really is going up and down quite a bit. So we'd like to understand why. Now, if you think about this experiment, this very simple experiment with safe and risky choices, what we know is that the dopamine neurons represent not only these reward prediction errors that I mentioned before, they also represent something about the expected values. So the average return from these gambles that people choose, or the values of the certain rewards that people choose. And we know that when they get their outcomes, that the dopamine neurons represent reward prediction errors. And so starting with this understanding of the neurobiology of reward, we propose this mathematical equation, which I know seems a little bit complicated, but really is pretty straightforward. All we're doing is asking whether the certain rewards people have experienced, the expected values from the gambles they've chosen, and the reward prediction errors resulting from those expectations cumulatively add up to determine your current happiness. And the only 2 parameters we also need to think about are there's a gamma parameter which determines how fast you forget about previous events. So you could never forget anything, or you could forget pretty quickly. And the W0 parameter at the beginning is a set point for happiness. So your happiness fluctuates around that and returns to it over time. So it's really, mathematically, it's not a complicated equation, but we want to know if it's of any use. Can we use these concepts from neurobiology of reward to predict people's happiness? So this is the data we're trying to predict. And that's how the model does. So the model does a great job. The model is really doing a good job of predicting how happiness will go up and down in each of these example participants. And we can see even in that third person where the model doesn't do quite as well, we still see some interesting features. So for example, at the end, it looks like the person is getting more emotionally volatile as time goes on, even though it does seem like it's going up and down at the right times. It's just actually more, it's moving more than the model would predict. So we see places where we might actually be able to improve our models. But the main point I want to make here is the model is doing a much better job than just knowing how much money people have at a given point in time. And these are the averages across our 26 participants. Does a great job of predicting happiness. And just to be clear on what what we get out of these equations. So this is the average parameter estimate for each of these 3 different weights: certain rewards, expected values, and reward prediction errors. These are always positive. That means all 3 of these things are significantly impacting happiness. Now, I mentioned we got data from our smartphone app. We got a lot of data. This is the first 200 people that play the smartphone app. The same result. This is anonymous players somewhere in the world. the next 200, the next 200. Actually, we could do this all day. We had so much data. We had, I think at this point, more than 50,000 people that had played this game, and it always looked the same. So this is the pattern, even in people that are anonymously playing somewhere in the world. They never see us. They don't get paid, and the same relationship. They have no incentive to tell us the truth about how they feel, but we see exactly the same relationship between the experience they have and how happy they feel from minute to minute. And I think that's actually really amazing, that we could use a smartphone game to study happiness, because we're not actually incentivizing them in any way to tell us the truth, but we see exactly the same thing as what we see in the lab. Now, we did this experiment in the lab in the MRI machine. And so we scanned people's brains while they were doing this task. And what we found was actually the same brain area that I mentioned before, the striatum, is predictive of changes in happiness. So if you measure bold activity, blood oxygen levels during the task, during the event of the task, you can actually predict how happy they will say they are the next time you ask them. So if the activity here is high, happiness tends to go up. If activity here is low, happiness tends to go down. So that's really interesting. That suggests dopamine might have some link to happiness that is involved in changing your happiness. Surprisingly, when you look at the time when you actually ask them how they feel, you don't see these dopamine related signals. Instead, what you find is an area of the brain called the right anterior insula. So at the moment you're asked, how happy are you this moment? There's more blood oxygen activity, the blood oxygen levels increase in this area on the side of the brain. And they increase more if you're going to say that you're more happy. And this is an area that's been linked to interoception, to feelings. So it's intuitive that this would be relevant, but this is not an area that receives a lot of dopaminergic input like these other areas that I mentioned. And this area has been linked to life satisfaction before. So there's lower gray matter volume in some other brain scanning experiments when people report having lower life satisfaction. So this is really interesting, and we're interested in whether we can understand better what's different about the signals in this brain area in people with depression compared to people without depression. Okay, so I mentioned that some of the signals are closely linked to dopamine. So one obvious question is whether dopamine is the thing that's making people happy. So the experiment we did was we tested people in 2 different occasions, and one day we gave them a placebo and one day we gave them L-Dopa, boosting their dopamine levels. This is very common, taken by millions of people, very common dopamine drug to increase dopamine levels for a few hours. And what we found, so this is what we found on placebo. So when they get a big reward, their happiness goes up a lot. When they get a small reward, it goes up a little bit. It's kind of what you'd expect. This is like chocolate cake or carrots. So, on placebo, you see what you'd expect. Now the question is, when you take a dopamine drug, is that boosting your happiness for all rewards? That's the kind of thing we might predict. That is not exactly what happened. What happens instead, which is really interesting, is that it boosts happiness for small rewards. It actually boosts it up to the same level as a large reward. So that actually makes it so that all rewards look basically the same. They all look like big rewards. Everything looks like chocolate cake if we're talking about snacks. So I think this is really interesting. It isn't the simple relationship some people predicted, that it would just boost all happiness. It's a little bit too simplistic, but it does strongly suggest that dopamine is playing a role in how much rewards impact how we feel from minute to minute. Okay, so I want to talk for a few minutes about another kind of domain where happiness might be interesting and different across individuals. So this is the social domain. So people have different social preferences. Some people are generous, some people not. We're interested in whether the emotions that people have are relevant to how generous they are. And so in this particular situation, we brought people into the lab in groups of 4, and they were told they were playing a game with another person who was in another room. They actually play the same gamble as someone else. So in this example, you're going to play a gamble where you could win 95 pence on this trial or get nothing. And Tom in the next room could also win 95 pence or get nothing. And let's say in this particular example, you win and Tom loses. Now, how do you feel? So you can report after every few trials how you feel. And we were interested in understanding what determines their happiness. Was it just their rewards? Was it something about the relationship between their rewards and Tom's rewards? That's what we wanted to find out. If you both win, happiness goes up a lot. That's kind of what you'd expect. Okay, so both people won, happiness goes up. If you have this kind of situation where you win and Tom loses, happiness goes up significantly, but not as much as if you both win. So this is on average. Okay, so we're not talking about individual differences. On average, happiness, what's called advantageous inequality, economists call that, significantly reduces happiness. Now, what about losses? So we see a similar thing here. If you lose and Tom loses, you're unhappy. But actually, if you lose and Tom wins, what's called disadvantageous inequality actually reduces your happiness even more. So on average, people don't like inequality in both, whether it's good or bad, or whether you get more or less than the other person. On average, people are preferring equality. But I did mention there's a lot of differences between individuals, and I think that's the thing that we want to understand now. So we used our happiness equation to capture ups and downs of happiness in the task in relation to expectations and prediction errors. And we added two extra terms, a parameter for what we think of as guilt, if you got more than another person, and a parameter is something like envy, if you got less than another person. Both these parameters were significantly negative on average. Both of these things are reducing happiness, and we can predict happiness over the experiment just as before. Okay, now what I didn't tell you is that the participants also did another experiment, what's called a dictator game, where they decide how much of an endowment to give to another person, someone they don't know. They say, how much of this money do you want to give to someone else? And a lot of people give nothing, a lot of people give half, and a lot of people give something in between that. No one gives more than half, not surprisingly. And what we found was that we looked at the parameters in this happiness equation, we could actually predict who was going to be generous and who was going to be stingy. And what we found is that the people that had stronger guilt parameters gave almost twice as, or actually over twice as much as the people that had stronger envy parameters. So we can actually predict based on how they felt during this other task, how generous they would be when they're given a choice about how much to give to someone else. Even though in the first experiment, there were never any options about how much to give to someone else or how to split money with someone else. So I think this is really interesting. This is the distribution of how much people gave. So a lot of people gave nothing, a lot of people gave half, a lot of people in between. And when we look at those different groups, the people that gave nothing had really strong envy parameters, but not guilt parameters. And the people that gave something have really strong guilt parameters, but not envy parameters. And I think this is interesting, partly because it means that the emotional responses that people have are sufficient to explain differences in generosity across individuals. So it's not all strategic. There is some component about how generous people are that really is closely linked to their emotions. So another domain where we might expect differences across individuals is in relation to psychiatric symptoms. So like the symptoms of depression. There's over 300 million people around the world that suffer from depression. And the two major symptoms are depressed mood and diminished pleasure, which we should be able to measure both of those in a task like this. And that's the experiment we did next. We asked whether there's what's thought of as a blunting, so a reduction in how strongly these different events affect people's happiness. That's the prediction. If you just don't feel rewards as much, there should be a reduction in how strongly rewards affect your happiness. This is 1,200 people that don't have depression, the normal pattern of parameter estimates in our model. And then we had around almost 600 people that have significant depressive symptoms. And in those people, you would predict a blunting, a reduction in emotional reactivity for rewards. We did not see that. In fact, if anything, we saw a slight increase. There was no difficulty with measuring happiness in depressed individuals. And if anything, a slight increase in how much it impacted their happiness. We looked at the level of the brain as well. So we scanned people in a similar task and we found no blunting there as well, which surprised a lot of people. And I think part of the reason is because people have done other tasks that are much more complicated, where people with depression might have different beliefs compared to people that are not. But this task is so simple. And the people with depression do not show any differences. But they did show a difference in the baseline parameter. So this is a set point around which their happiness oscillates. You can see it going up and down around that value. And if people are more depressed, they oscillate around a lower value. And this is a really strong effect. And I think this also suggests that their happiness they're reporting in the games is actually very closely related to their overall happiness in their regular life. And one thing that we're trying to do now is to understand whether the parameters in these games are related to their level of depression. If we can measure people repeatedly over weeks or even months, which is something we're doing with our new smartphone app, the Happiness Project, then we can ask whether these parameters will, for example, get reduced right before someone is about to get more depressed. So that's a question that we are now trying to answer. And so we're doing that with this new smartphone app, the Happiness Project. And I'll just show you a little video of what it looks like. And I'll talk more about one of the tasks to finish off this presentation. So this is a learning task where you also have a chance to win a lot of points or lose a lot of points. This is a task where you are fishing and people tend to tap more when they get more, they have more rewards they can get. I'll talk more about this task in a minute. And this is our standard kind of task. And we kind of set it up so that people are encouraged to play repeatedly, because they can progress along this map and earn badges as they complete the different tasks in the game. So I'll just talk about one of these tasks, because I think it's really interesting and relevant to this question about what depression does. So in this task, you're digging for treasure, and the deeper the treasure, the less likely you are to get it. Now you can see there's some blocks in the future. The next block is actually red, and that actually means that your next block, you won't have the opportunity to win any points. You actually are trying to avoid losing points. Here you lose 20 points. And you can see now again, in the future, the next block is another one where you could win points. And so it alternates between gain and loss blocks. And we were interested in whether we could understand better how the information about the future influences how you feel right now. And it does quite strongly. So when you are in a loss frame, if you know that the future looks bright, your happiness on average is higher. And if the future looks not so good, then your happiness is lower. And this is the same thing that happens if you're in a gain frame. So in both situations, people on average care about the future. Now, just as in the social experiments and these other experiments, there's a lot of variation across individuals. A lot of people care to different degrees about the future. Some people basically ignore it, and some people, it matters a lot for their happiness and for the decisions they make. And it looks like we're also seeing some evidence that if you're depressed, you're actually more sensitive to that information when you're in one of these loss situations. So this is something that we're now working on right now. Okay, so now we're left with the question of what you can do with this information in your regular life, if anything. So I want you to think about a situation that probably none of you have ever been in or will be, but you can imagine. So if you were in the Olympics and you won a silver medal, how would you feel? So you might think, well, I mean, that you won a silver medal at the Olympics, that's amazing. That's not actually something that any of us ever expect, probably any of us ever expect to get. That would be amazing. But what actually tends to happen is that people look a little bit disappointed. So this is one Olympian getting the silver medal. Here's another one. Here's a whole team, a swim team that got the silver medal. None of them is looking very happy about this. And at one level, you probably can understand it when you think about it. But if you think a little bit more deeply, they basically have, I mean, there's so many people they beat to get the silver medal. There's so many people they beat. There's only one person in the world that's better than them at something, and they're still disappointed. And that, of course, now it's obvious when you think about it, like they wanted the gold. They thought they were going to get the gold, and they've been training for years to get the gold. And they, in that sense, they failed in that, and maybe they were really close. And so you could understand why they would be unhappy about it. And that kind of led people to think that when I published this work, that the solution to this was to just be to have low expectations all the time. Okay, so just expect the worst. You always be happy about the outcome. That's that prediction error. So if you actually had low expectations and you won a silver medal, you'd be pretty excited. So that kind of makes sense on one level, but on another level, it doesn't. And the problem here is this other term in the middle, the expectations term. So what people are kind of thinking is set low expectations, blow them away. That is the solution. Okay, that's how you can be happier. Now, the problem, if you look at the math a little bit more, is this expected value term in the middle. And that one is a little tricky because that one is affecting your happiness before you find out the outcomes of your decisions. So if I'm, for example, so I have my prediction errors, we've already talked about that, but those expectations are just as important for happiness before you find out what happens. So if I'm looking forward to going to a movie or watching a movie like this one, Soul, I hear it's pretty good. And so my expectation, once I'm gonna watch it, my expectation could be positive, and I'm gonna be happy about that. But if I just expect the worst about everything, then I can't actually tell which movie to watch. So I can't actually tell whether I want to watch this one or this other movie, Cats, which no one says is good. Apologies if there's any fans in the audience, but no one says this is a good movie. But if I just expect everything is going to be terrible, I'm not going to actually be able to decide, and I probably won't watch any movie. And I definitely will not be training for the Olympics, because people that train for the Olympics for years and years have very high expectations. Otherwise, they wouldn't be motivated to actually do it. So you can see that these expectations are actually quite important for the decisions we make. And there's not a good way of just hacking your happiness and just having low expectations all the time as a solution to increasing your happiness. But I think there's a lot we can learn from these kinds of mathematical equations. We're starting to gather data from a lot of people, thousands of people around the world using our smartphone app, the Happiness Project, and that's giving us a better understanding of what determines happiness from minute to minute and how it relates to happiness in your overall life satisfaction, and also depression. And the hope is that the insights that we'll get will help everyone be, well, especially the people that are depressed, but we'll have potential treatments that can be informed by the results of our experiments. And hopefully the research we can do can make everyone just a little bit happier. So thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Covered a lot in a short amount of time. So what we'll do now is we'll open it up for questions. So if anybody has questions, feel free to either use the Zoom function on the bottom. There should be a raise hand function that you can use, or you can enter your question directly in the chat box, and I can either call on you or read your question out loud for you. And of course, if you are asking a question, it would be best if you had your camera on so that we can actually have some face-to-face interaction. And I just want to say that, like, thank you again for taking the time. And this is an incredible privilege for people to be able to ask Professor Rutledge like a question directly. And so this is a pretty rare opportunity. And so I do encourage people to take advantage of that. In the meantime, while people are coming up with questions, I have a lot of questions.
I'm happy to talk about anything you guys are interested in.
Yeah. Yeah. So please ask your questions. I'll just start off with a couple questions. And if people have some, then I'll turn over to them. So you talked about the expectations at the end. It's commonly said that, like, oh, just like before you go to a movie or before you like go into like a nice meal, you say like, oh, I'm just going to lower your expectations so you can be like pleasantly surprised, right? I think that's like a pretty common strategy that people do. And you don't want to like hype something up too much. So, but it seems that based on the formula you had, that isn't quite true. So practically, what would you recommend us do in these situations?
Okay, yeah. So good question. So yeah, so it didn't seem most optimistic at the end there. So I think it relates to like whether if you're in your normal environment and it's like the kind of place you go to lunch like all the time, it doesn't really make sense to like lower your expectations or raise your whatever, because it's a place you would go back to, and probably you go back to like fairly regularly. You go back to there every week or every month or something. And so in that kind of situation, you want to have realistic expectations because they're guiding your decisions. That's helping you learn like which restaurant you like and which one you don't. I think the situation where you can kind of manipulate. I think it's probably better if you manipulate someone else's happiness. That's actually a lot easier. So if you give someone a gift, you should not tell them it's amazing right when you hand it to them. It's too late. Like there's no time for them to be like, so if they have like some time to look forward to it and they kind of know how good it will be and it will increase their happiness, like you book a holiday with a friend or something and you're both like really looking forward to it. Okay, I can see that's a situation where you have a long time where you could potentially enjoy it. And even if like maybe you're getting your expectations a little bit too high, maybe that's a situation where like at the end you'd be like, okay, wait, let's hang on a second. All right, okay, we're both very excited to go on this trip, but maybe our expectations are a little too high. Like maybe this, there's a lot of stuff that could go wrong. Okay, but that whole time you're enjoying that like planning, that's actually probably fine. It's not a thing that you're doing all the time, but if it's like at the restaurant you go to every week, or something that you're doing repeatedly, then you probably just want to have realistic expectations. So the rarer the thing is, the safer it is. The farther out in time it is, the more it's safe to like look forward to it. It's actually totally fine. You do want to have not too high expectations. And definitely, I think if your friend has already agreed they're going to come with you to a movie, they're not totally sure whether they want to watch it or not, but they said they'll come with you. And you're excited to see it, you probably shouldn't tell them you're super, super excited and you're expecting it's going to be like an amazing movie, because they didn't even really want to see it. They're just going because you made them. and you probably you're probably better off lowering their expectations a little bit, so that at the end of it they're like, oh, actually that was like pretty good, that was better than I thought it would be. That's what you're going for in that situation. So you can kind of use that information with the friend. Also, that works if you really want them to like a restaurant that you really like, then get them to come to it, but don't tell them too much. Don't tell them it's your favorite restaurant. Just let them find out for themselves, and they'll be happier for it.
All right. So that sounds like actually it's pretty close to what I'm normally doing.
Oh, good. You already figured this one out. The science agrees.
Yeah. Um, so I'm just looking through the questions that are in the chat. So Ivy had a question that I think was related, which is she said, what about no expectations? Does it have any impact on happiness if you have no expectations? I guess, is it possible to have no expectations? But
Yeah. Okay. So I think I'll change that question a little bit. So like maybe let's say having no expectations is just like you're not really sure at all what to expect of a situation, like whether it would be good or bad. In a sense, like that is a kind of expectation. But I think there's something important to Ivy's question, is that like it's hard to have a good prediction error if you didn't actually expect anything, like you just have no idea what's going on. Um, because you just don't really know how to evaluate what happened. It's like okay, so it would be like if you open a present from someone and you're not even really sure what it is, then it's hard to be too excited, either or happy or unhappy, because you're just like, I'm not totally sure what this present does. Um, and so if someone explains it to you, then eventually you may be like, oh, I could kind of see how that would be. That sounds kind of useful. Um, but the best thing is like at the moment they open the present, they instantly know what it is. They instantly know how good it is, and it beats their expectations. So I think that's one way of thinking about like this question is like you can't really learn very efficiently if you don't have expectations or if you don't know how to interpret the information you're getting.
all right, great. You talked about reward prediction error. Jerry has a question. Jerry, I'm gonna unmute you, and maybe you can expand a little bit on what you were trying to ask, if that's okay.
Yeah. You said about something about the reward prediction error. Um, I think I have a question about it because I can't interpret what really it is. I know that the expected value is that you how much you expect the reward is, and it will influence your happiness. And the certain reward is how much you get, so that impact your happiness. So what the reward prediction error in our real life, what it can be to influence our happiness? That's my question.
So do a follow up if I'm not completely understanding it. But so the prediction errors are just defined as the actual magnitude of an outcome minus the expectation. So that would be like in the example of the roulette table, if you expect to get $20, if the average that you would get from that roulette table is $20 because you're betting $40 on red, then the prediction error if you win is plus $20. You got $20 more than you would on average, and if you lose you get $20 less than average, minus 20. And if you were in a situation, which doesn't work with the roulette table, but in real life, like if you went to a restaurant that you go to often and you expect it to be pretty good, that's why you go there, and it's basically exactly what you expected, then you have no prediction error. It's zero prediction error. And the reason why that's kind of interesting is obviously when you went to the restaurant, you expected it to be good, otherwise you wouldn't have gone there. And so there is reward. You are experiencing something that you enjoy, but there's no prediction error. And the thing that's really important for that is that means you shouldn't learn anything. So everything was exactly like you expected. You should not update your beliefs about the environment. And the thing that's really powerful about this kind of approach is this is actually really at the core of modern artificial intelligence algorithms, this like very simple concept. Because if you think about like, I'm sure many of you are familiar with like the AlphaGo, which is DeepMind's like Go playing, artificial intelligence algorithm, which is like has reinforcement, because basically that algorithm learned how to play Go like from, well, I guess the modern, the more advanced version, AlphaZero, learned how to play Go just from playing against itself and just having information available to them, and then getting these prediction errors and updating their values assigned to different positions of the board based on these prediction errors. And so it's actually like a big part of why those algorithms are so successful, is because they just take enormous amounts of experience, enormous amount of actions and feedback, and the prediction errors based on those, like whether things are surprisingly good or bad, are being used to train those algorithms.
Okay, thank you. But I think in the certain reward and the gap between the certain reward and your expect value can sometimes influence your happiness. So so in my mind, I think that's the thing that the reward prediction error can be. Is that okay?
Well, that's not how we set it up, but I understand your intuition is good, because you could think of like concepts like regret. Like if you make a decision and like you could have gotten some other thing more safely, that could be something that could influence your happiness. And I think that's part of what you're noticing.
Yeah.
That difference is also another kind of variable that might be relevant to how you feel. And in this environment, that turned out not to be the case, but it's a totally reasonable prediction. My bet is that in other situations where that difference is actually like kind of informative about whether you made a mistake or not, it might have a bigger impact. So I could definitely see that happening in some situations. Like in real life, that is actually probably fairly common, because it captures this idea of regret that many of us will, feel if things didn't go quite like we wanted them to go.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Jerry. Next, we have Evelyn. Evelyn, I'm going to unmute you if you want to ask. If not, I can also ask.
Sure. So my question is, you talked about dopamine level and happiness, and I know there are like also other neurotransmitters which has the function of controlling people's happiness, for example, serotonin. So I'm curious if simply injecting those um as like a form of medicine can raise people's happiness level, if that's a feasible solution.
Yeah, so that's a good question. The simple answer is no. And I think the reason is that the relationship, like the function of those neurotransmitters is our increasing knowledge in neuroscience is showing that they're actually quite complicated. They're actually playing many different functions. They have many different receptors, and they're sending many different kinds of signals. And the brain is always kind of adapting to the level of those signals in a way that lets you be ready for whatever happens to you. So you could imagine that like the circumstances of your life are very different from other people that you might know, because they, for example, have a different job, they live in a different place, they live with different people. And so the brain, everyone's brain is adapting to those different circumstances. And so the absolute level of any of these kinds of signals isn't actually something the brain in general uses to, for example, determine how you feel. And it's more like the changes in those signals are what relates to our feelings. And so one thing that isn't within our technological capabilities is that perhaps the neurotransmitters like dopamine or serotonin could be elevated at very specific times. So if you're in a situation where you really should be feeling, you really should be attentive, you really should be rewarded for something that you did that everyone agrees is like a great thing you did, and that would be potentially a time where you might want to have like that burst of dopamine or burst of serotonin that would help reinforce and help you learn about the things you're doing that you're doing well. And timing those, like that's something we just can't do. But that's probably the situations in which dopamine and serotonin aren't actually having the kind of effects where we learn, actually, we have friends we can rely on, we did a good job. And people that are depressed may not notice that as much because of differences in how their dopamine and serotonin systems are working, but just boosting them in general won't actually solve that. Unfortunately, we need something that's a bit more targeted to the specific situations where they should go up and they should go down. So it's a really good question, but yeah, unfortunately, the brain is pretty complicated, and so there isn't an easy fix in that area.
Great, thank you. Lee, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, so I'll keep my camera off because I have, I think, connection issues. Sorry
Okay,
about that.
no problem. No, that's fine.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the insightful sharing. So my question is about what's your suggestion on manage and even master our own emotions? Because in daily life, you mostly feel like the emotions, your emotions are driving you to make certain reactions and feelings. I think it would be ideal if, in the opposite, you can be more in control of your feelings or emotions. So so what's your suggestion? Thank you.
So I'm not a clinical psychologist, and I don't know, that I don't know that much about the different strategies that, for example, for regulating emotions, which actually are well studied. The insights that we can get from our studies, I mean, I think there are a couple of things that are helpful. So one of those things is that the happiness, the events that influence happiness, it decays pretty quickly in time. So once you have more emotionally relevant events happening, then you kind of forget about the ones that happened even a minute or two ago because so many things are happening. And this may not be surprising if if you play some video games, you can actually, if you think back, like what you were doing a minute or two ago actually maybe doesn't really influence that much how you feel because so many things have happened recently. And I think in real life, that's maybe, sometimes that's, that could be reassuring that, like, if you just sit there and you're feeling bad, it may persist for quite some time because there's nothing else to kind of replace that. There's no other emotionally relevant events for you to experience. But if you find a way of going out and doing things that matter to you, then that's a way of having those new events influence your emotions and having the older events kind of pushed out. So I think that's one thing that we can say about it. I mean, I think it's challenging in general. I think that the situation that we, like, obviously we don't have that much control over emotions except to realize that our emotions will pass, that that we don't have to make our decisions based on them. If we're in a good mood or a bad mood, we can we can try to pause and not make a decision too quickly based on those emotions. And one way of thinking about that is if you're about to make a decision and you make the decision, maybe you write it down, and then you wait a while, you wait an hour or something, and you see if you still want to make the same decision. And if you still want to make the same decision at multiple time points, then it's probably the thing you want to do. But if you feel like actually like an hour later, you're like, wait, why? I don't really want to do that. Then maybe that's a good sign that, like, actually the first time you felt like that because of an emotion you're feeling at that moment. So I think you do have some control over your circumstances. If you know certain things are actually more relevant to your happiness, you can try to put yourself more often in situations that you know are happiness increasing. But that's more a kind of an awareness of your emotions and the things that are causing it. And so obviously we're doing these very precise experiments to find out, like, very specific things relevant to emotions. But everyone can think about in their regular life the things that matter most. Maybe write a list of them, and just try to make sure that, like, in every day there's several things on that list that they know are improving, are relevant, to their happiness and increase their happiness. And there's no shortcuts here. So this is, like, one of the things about happiness, like, it should keep on adapting as your circumstances adapt, because your brain is always trying to adapt to your current circumstances. But there are these little things we can do where we can make decisions about our environment to just try to understand how they work and use that a little bit to our advantage.
Thank you so much. That's very powerful, actually. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lee. I'm just going to ask a quick follow-up on that. I mean, there were some surprising results, I think, from your study in terms of the effect that depression has and does not have. And in particular, I feel like the sort of the relative effect of depression, and how, when you're already depressed, everything is kind of suppressed, but the overall effect actually is not what you expected. So can you kind of talk a little bit more about the upshot of what you found out so far about depression, and what, if any, kind of clinical applications you guys may have so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we see this shift, which actually in some ways is kind of reassuring. It shows us that the happiness that people are reporting while they play this game. So you might expect that like everything just normalizes to the game. Everything is in the frame of reference to the game. They don't actually know we're going to ask them about their depression. We send them the questionnaire several weeks later after they played the game. We asked them later, hey, can you play this depression questionnaire? Several thousand people did. And they may not even remember that they played the game, because if they haven't played it in several weeks, you know, not going to take it personally. But this relationship is really strong. And so I think that means like, that's really nice. Like that does mean that the information they're reporting during the game is actually like, is related to their symptoms, but not quite exactly as you said, not quite in the way we expected. And so we kind of expected both of those things to be shifted, and only one of them was very strongly across our population. One of them wasn't. But actually in some ways, I think that's kind of reassuring, because what that means is the responses that depressed people have to these events are actually not that different. So they're getting upset about the same things. They're getting happy about the same things. Their emotions are moving up and down for this very simple environment in a way that means that if part of the problem with people that are depressed is that they have the beliefs about their world, about their environment, that are really hurtful for them, really aren't helping them. It's not as if they can't have these prediction errors that could change their beliefs. And so it may be that like they're having the feeling, but then it just doesn't change what they think. And we have seen evidence in other experiments that might be the case, but at least that gives us another clue as to like where to target, because it means like the emotional response to something, they are paying attention, they are noticing when something goes well or doesn't go well. And that for some reason, when something goes well, for example, they don't then use that information to know actually things that are likely to go well in the future. They're in a game where like they're learning something and they figured out the puzzle and they know what the right thing to do is, their emotions are saying at one level that they like realize that they're doing the right thing, but at another level, they're not actually improving their choices in the way that someone that wasn't depressed is. And so we'd hope that like we can kind of use that information to like target that specific process that is changing people's beliefs. And that may be something that we could do with clever kinds of experiments or interventions, that the kind of things that cognitive psychologists or clinical psychologists will work with, and we might be able to improve those therapies to kind of target that belief process a bit better.
Great, thanks. I have lots of follow-up for that, but I'm going to jump to one more question from the chat. This is from Jackie Wu, who unfortunately can't turn on her mic, but I'm a Penn grad and currently working in a university in China as a psychology lecturer. And every time when I get to the topic of happiness, I always hesitate how to approach this topic, as I have observed two ways to explain happiness up to now. In the positive sense, we can see that happiness level of car accident survivors, for example, gradually get back to the previous level over a period of time. From a negative perspective, we find that as long as we are pursuing happiness, happiness looms larger, which means we will never achieve the real happiness. So the question then is, how can we, of these approaches, or maybe another approach, which would you endorse? Or I guess the more general question is, so what do we do with all this talk about happiness and the psychology of happiness, and how are we actually supposed to talk about it?
So the car accident studies, which is that happiness surprisingly comes back up relatively quickly. A year later, people are basically back up to normal. It kind of mirrors the lottery winner findings that I mentioned, that basically a year later, people are kind of back to normal. It's not 100% the case, but it's mostly the case. And that's true in lots of situations when good or bad things happen to people. And in some ways, actually, if you think about the car accident situation, that is what you want to happen. So if someone has a car accident, but then they kind of adjust and their life isn't the same as it was before, but they find ways of making it work, then it's kind of reassuring in some ways that for most of those people, their happiness actually comes back pretty much up to where it was before the car accident. In some ways surprising, you wouldn't think that would happen, but actually I think this is a sign of what I mentioned, is that the human brain is always trying to adapt to your circumstances. Your circumstances are going to be different than they were 10 years ago. They're going to be different in 10 years. They're going to be different in 20 years. And your brain has to be able to handle that and make good decisions, even though your circumstances just naturally change across your lifespan. Even if no major event of either winning the lottery or getting in a car accident happens to anyone here, your circumstances will change a lot. And I think this comes to like your kind of second point, which is that pursuing happiness is very tricky. And if we think about some of these results I've mentioned, it kind of seems that perhaps a better way to think about how happy you feel from minute to minute, like what it is more like a tool. So it's the happiness, how you like feel right now or 5 minutes from now or 5 minutes ago, is like you could think of it as a tool that reflects things about your current circumstances, whether things are getting better or worse. That's something we actually hypothesize might be part of the function of happiness. So if your environment is getting better, if things have been getting better lately, then that means different things about what decisions you make. So if you're in a situation where you could leave at any point, and you're actually kind of happy about it, then that's a good sign that like maybe you should stick around, because things have been going better than they were before, and hopefully that means they'll continue to stay better. And if things are getting worse, then that's maybe a time to leave. If you're at a party and you're not really enjoying yourself, you probably should go, because there's not a good reason often to believe things are going to get better. And I think that's partly what your happiness is tracking. It's tracking something like mathematically, you could think of it as like the derivative of your environment, like something like whether your environment is getting better or worse. And that is a useful quantity for the brain to represent, because the world is not random. So if the environment is getting better, it tends to keep getting better. If the environment is getting worse, it tends to keep getting worse. That's not always true, of course. Some things actually are random, like coin flips are random. But in general, if someone's nice to you repeatedly, they're probably going to stay nice to you. There's no reason to believe like they're suddenly going to turn on you. And so I think that's one way you could think about your happiness from minute to minute, is something that's like a tool that you can use to make good decisions in your life. So I think pursuing that kind of happiness is kind of a mistake. It's just not probably going to get you what you want, partly for the reasons are mentioned, that you just never actually achieve it. But I do think like life satisfaction, or like being satisfied with your life, is something that we don't quite understand how it works or how it relates to your happiness from minute to minute. Obviously, how you feel from minute to minute is like a dominant part of your conscious experience. Like it is, if you ask someone how they're feeling, like you're not usually going to get an answer about like how satisfied they are with their life. You're usually going to get an answer about like right now, like, and maybe something that happened to them that day. Not over the last year or something. And so I think we still have that elusive like how do we increase how satisfied with our lives, but I think those are probably kind of related. If you are using your happiness as a tool in order to make good decisions, and you're in general putting yourself in situations where you kind of like what's going on, there are things you value, then actually that probably is a recipe for having higher life satisfaction. So I think that's how you could think of, even though just trying to achieve the goal of being more satisfied is challenging, just being aware of your happiness and what it means. You don't have to obsess about it, but if you're just aware of it and you notice when it's consistently in the same situation, low or high, that's a sign of things you might want to try to do more, to prioritize more in your life, or things you might want to try to avoid if you can. If you're in a situation where you're really unhappy and you notice it happens to you every week, and you can find some way of avoiding it, some way of getting out of it, then that's something that you could make a change and make decisions that change your circumstances. And that will probably, that will show up in your happiness, because those situations where you're really unhappy on a regular basis will stop happening as much. And presumably, if you can do that for a lot of things in your life that are important, then most people would be more satisfied with their lives. And also, they'd kind of feel like they're in more control of their situation. And that's obviously a good thing.
Great, thank you. So it seems like this idea of relativity is pretty important, right? Because we're talking about your happiness relative to your previous happiness, your happiness relative to your environment, as well as your relative happiness to other people around you and their circumstances, right? So there's a lot of comparison going on, in both a negative and a positive way, I guess. And I've always sort of felt like, usually it's not helpful to compare yourself to others, because it's, like the silver medalist situation. You tend to be, comparing yourself to the one person who's better versus all the other people you're better off than. So can you kind of talk about that? I noticed that was kind of a trend throughout the findings, but does the finding bear that out?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of mentioned that it's kind of good that your brain is always kind of adapting, because it's kind of you could think of it as like you make the same decisions about like the same brain has to make a decision about like what to get for lunch, which is something where like the difference between like a good decision and a bad decision at the same cafe is very, very small. Okay, these are very small. You know, the total value of that difference is like less than $1. And the same brain has to make a decision like, where do I go to school? Or like, do I take this job or this other job? Which is obviously, or who do I marry? You know, these huge decisions. And the same brain has to be able to do both of those things, like decide where to go to lunch and like what to get for lunch and like what job to take. And your brain can do that because it can adapt to these different situations, and it kind of adjusts and uses the same neural circuitry to make these comparisons and weigh up these. And sometimes, obviously, some things like if you're deciding like, you know, which apartment to rent or something, there's like so many different features of an apartment, where it's located, like, you know, things about the layouts, like how the bedroom looks, what the, you know, how much noise. There's just so many different dimensions. You might think like, this is a really hard, I can't tell which is the better one. They're both good in different ways. And so it's true, like your brain does have trouble like solving that question. But actually, I think in that situation, like often if you have all the information and you just know, you gather all the information you have, and then you just go with your gut, your brain does a pretty decent job of integrating over a lot of information and just saying like, well, you know, I think this one's the better one. And you may not know exactly what it was about that that's like the thing that's making it better, but your brain does a good job of like handling all these really complicated situations we're in. And that's partly why all of this stuff is so relative. And so obviously there's situations where that's bad. It's like there's like the keeping up with the Joneses kind of situation where like someone else gets something and now you want it too, but like you didn't even care about that thing last year, or it didn't even exist last year. It's like a new thing. And so you could think of that as only being a bad thing. The good thing there is like also people get motivated because they also see what's possible. And so you could say like, if you know that someone was able to achieve something, you might also think I could also achieve that. So just not worrying about like the having more material possessions, but just like for like, say for an athlete, if you see what someone is able to achieve, then you kind of know like something is possible, and that if you work hard, maybe you'll also be able to achieve it. And obviously, sometimes it ends up with disappointment because all those people that are willing to spend like their entire careers on a sport, they obviously think they could get a gold medal. Otherwise, they couldn't do it. And other people obviously think they also could get a gold medal. Otherwise, they wouldn't be sponsored to do that sport. And so there's a lot of other reinforcement that's kind of like supporting this same idea. So it's actually not really that surprising they would be disappointed about second place, given the circumstances they were probably in. So I think this one kind of goes both ways. I think if you just kind of are aware of it and you think about like whether the feeling you have about some like relative comparison is actually good for you, like actually motivational or like a reasonable thing, that can be helpful, because there are some situations where like, yeah, actually my circumstances are not that great. And like, really, this is not a good environment for me. And really like, there is a better job because I don't actually find this job that fulfilling. And when I talk to some friends, like they actually have jobs they really enjoy. And so that can be really helpful for like saying, okay, yeah, I think it's possible. I'm gonna go try to get another job because this is not actually the right one for me. But of course, at the same time, like as we mentioned, like if you're just like jealous of someone else because of their success, and there's no way of you actually changing anything about what you do. I don't compare myself to celebrities. My life is so different from theirs. It's not helpful. And so people that, you know, do, that's usually, it's not a helpful thing. And so there are trade-offs there. And if you're kind of just aware of what you're feeling and why you're feeling it, and whether there's anything you should change in your life as a result of it, that's probably pretty healthy. And you won't get in kind of trouble where you're just like always jealous of someone where you could never have that. It's not realistic. So I think that's probably a good way of thinking about that. But it's tricky because your brain is just trying to help you make decisions, and there's no like one decision that is always the right answer. A lot of life is about decisions where there is no right answer. You just kind of have to make a decision at some point.
I mean, I think that in itself is pretty helpful to have that perspective as well. So great. So somebody did ask me a direct question, which was since you were at UCL before and you're now at Yale, to compare the two schools and the environment for doing research between the schools. But I am going to expand that question a little bit. into a more general question, which is you've now done research in the U.S. as well as the U.K. And I guess the more general question is, and we've talked about this a little bit before between you and me, of research in psychology in general, where historically the research has always been in Western countries, college students, typically upper middle class, white, and so it seems like a lot of the results are going to be very skewed. What I love about your research is that you have a global audience, and so you're doing research on people around the world, and so I find that to be a much more helpful model, I guess. And so the general question, I guess, is to talk about the environment of studying psychology right now in different places around the world and what you know about it, and to compare it and to say what is the future direction, I guess, of the field in general.
I mean, your question is getting broader and broader.
Yeah.
I'll start with like the more specific question. It's kind of like related to the question that came in. Then you can ask me again the much broader one. So there's lots of great things about both UCL and Yale and the UK system versus the US system. At different levels, I think it's kind of, the UK system is often more focused for training. So obviously at the undergraduate level, it's 3 years instead of 4, and it's much more, specific training, like you would only be taking psychology classes. At the graduate level, it's also more focused in the sense that it's a 3-year PhD or sometimes a 4-year PhD, but people often have done several years in between undergrad and grad school, although that's increasingly common in the US as well. Like as a research assistant or a master's degree is very common for PhD students at UCL. Both of them are great places to do science. So there's not one place that's like better. I think it's like, and obviously those are both great places to live, very different. And I think so I think UK and the US are both great places for science, for international science people. Lots of people come there to the US, lots of people come to London from other places. So most of the people that were working in my lab were from all around the world. So yeah, there were students from China, from Singapore, from India, from throughout Europe. And so it was really a diverse group of people that were coming to London. And that, I think, it makes it an exciting environment for doing science. And I think actually, so that relates to Devin's like broader question of like where psychology is going. So I don't think it's going this direction fast enough. I mean, I think this question about like, people have become aware of this concept of like weird populations, like Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic populations, like US, psychology students is like a prime example. US psychology students at US universities is like definitely that group. And that is like the foundation of like psychology at Western universities. But I think increasingly people are aware of the issues. Increasingly people are doing cross-cultural studies. We are starting to do that. But obviously there are extra issues that come up. So for example, with our smartphone app, it's in English. It's on iOS and Android. And so obviously that means that like in a place like China, we don't have very many people, and the people that do play on the app that are in China obviously are not representative because they're English speakers, and they found a way of downloading it because it's not available in the standard app stores. But we do get a lot more diversity, and we do collect information now about people's native language, and the app is available. And I mean, there's people from over 100 countries that have downloaded it. So we are starting to get at these questions, and these questions about emotions and happiness and decision-making are a lot of the questions that we want to answer. And I hope that over the next decade, there'll be a lot more of this kind of research. There'll be a lot more collaborations between, for example, universities in Asia and universities in the West to run the same paradigms, because they're so easy now to run paradigms online, to run them on smartphones, that there's no reason why we can't get this data. It does take a bit more effort. And I think the major issue with for students at Western institutions is that there's not a lot of people, not a lot of grad students that are really interested in that question. It's kind of surprising, but obviously in some sense it's kind of intuitive. Same thing is there's not a lot of graduate students that are interested in what happens when people get older. What happens across the lifespan. there are some, and that's great, but there's not a lot of 25-year-olds that are interested in the psychology of 75-year-olds. Not as much as, for example, people are interested in things like consciousness or how people learn, or decision making. And so you can kind of understand, like, people are interested in things that are more relevant to their lives. And so I hope there will be more people that are interested in these cross-cultural issues because they're so important. Obviously, if we're going to have a theory for happiness for humans, it's got to work for everyone. And it's totally fine if the things that people in different countries or different, if you live in a big city versus in a rural area, the values that you might have might be quite different. But it would be surprising and disappointing if the same equations don't basically work, and with just different values for the parameters. So different values, for example, for a parameter related to generosity, for a parameter related to expectations, we'd expect that those things would vary in systematic ways in different kinds of people, just because of their different life circumstances, which we were talking about before, and the different values that they have that are relevant to how they experience the world and what determines whether their happiness goes up and down.
Right. So have you found any interesting kind of findings that are like particular to specific cultures that are surprisingly different, or has it been fairly consistent across the board?
So far, things seem pretty consistent, but it's hard to tell yet whether that's mostly because we haven't yet translated our app in, and so we really get a more realistic sample, because then we're kind of getting the same people as if we were testing. For example, if we have data from Asia, it's not that different from the group of people that were, like, for example, studying abroad, doing a degree in London.
Right.
They're very much, that's just a group that's like more exposed to Western culture and Western ideas about psychology, and not exactly what we'd want for having a really great understanding cross-culturally about how these really basic aspects of human behavior and emotion work.
Right.
So we're getting there, but slowly.
Yeah. Which is a perfect transition to Jackie's comment, which is, it would be great to have a Chinese version of your app, then I can show it to my students, which I think is a great idea. Jackie, maybe you can send an email to Rob and volunteer to translate the app and help with it. So with that, I think that's a good place to stop there, which is, Rob, why don't you give a final plug for your app? And this is a great opportunity for those of you guys here to actually be able to help participate in the study and to play these games. And maybe you can do a quick spiel on how everybody can help out.
Yeah, okay, so I just put the link for the website in the chat box, thehappinessproject.app. It's available for iOS or Android. I don't know quite how that works in China. Yeah, I would love to translate it at some point. It is something that we're thinking about. There's lots of obviously great science going on in China these days, and especially psychological, neurobiological science. So it makes a lot of sense for thinking about all these questions, because the circumstances for people growing up in China are very different than people growing up in the US, in lots of ways that could influence their values and the decisions they make. And so part of what we are doing with our app, the Happiness Project, is asking people to play these games. They're like 2 or 3 minute games. They're really short games, where we're getting, they're basically like psychology experiments that you probably are familiar with, and with some added components, like to try to make them a little bit more fun. We can't quite make them into like real video games, because we then lose the ability to like control the things that we need to do our research. And so that's one reason, besides our technological capabilities, they're not as fun as potentially other games that you have on your phone. Sorry, we're doing our best. So the most valuable kind of data for our research is if people play the games once and answer the questionnaires, which takes only about 15 minutes, and then a couple of weeks later plays them again. So really, like, if we had thousands of people play it for half an hour, 15 minutes in a couple day period, and then 15 minutes like a couple weeks or a month later, and then we send notifications to people after a couple of weeks to kind of tell them that would be really helpful. so they know, like, what would be the most valuable way they could contribute. Because I think one of the things that's really great about the smartphone app is not only we can show people what our psychology experiments are like, they can get a better feeling, they can learn a bit. We have a little bit in each game about like what the game is studying, how you could think about it in your real life, you know, like the situation about like, how do you think about your expectations when you go to a restaurant or something. And so we kind of try to teach a little bit about that in the app. And so, yeah, so people can see what our research is like, but they can also contribute to it. And I think a lot of people that have played our games appreciate the ability to contribute to science, because obviously so many people really think science is really important, and they don't have a good way of contributing to it in general. They have a job that doesn't potentially involve science at all, but they do think it's really important. They think it's interesting, and being able to give half an hour of their time for research on human decision making and emotions, you know, well, it's an easy thing to do. And I know a lot of people do appreciate having the opportunity, and obviously we appreciate them contributing, because we wouldn't be able to make these discoveries. Like we made a lot of discoveries from just thousands of people around the world taking 15, 20 minutes out of their day to like play games, and it anonymously sends us the data, so we can try to figure out what makes people take risks, what makes people decide to choose one thing over the other, what makes people decide to take an effort, make a big effort for something, and what determines whether your happiness goes down or goes up.
Fantastic. So yeah, I mean, the scale of this project is incredible. You know, most experiments that I know, that, you know, the sample size is like 20, 30, 40 people, you know, 100 if you're lucky. I mean, the scale is just incredible. And again, it's an amazing opportunity for people to actually have a direct participation in a psychological study, and contribute to science. So I do encourage all of you to check out the happinessproject.app. It's available on iOS and other app stores. Check it out, and it would be great if people would be willing to at least play it and try it out. You know, it's like 15 minutes a day. You know, it's literally when you're waiting for the subway or the taxi or the bus, you know, when you're working and you're taking a break, you know, before you sleep, whatever. You know, it's quite a unique opportunity. So I do encourage you guys to do that. Thank you, Professor Rutledge, for an incredible time of sharing and answering questions. Thank you for being so generous with your time.
Thanks everyone for lots and lots of great questions and discussion. It was really fun to talk to all of you about psychology and about happiness.